going to try to speak to you like this. And you tell me if you can't hear me. It's important to me that you can hear me. So if this is not sufficient, I will use the mic, but otherwise I will use the loud voice that a reader or lecturer needs to have so that the readings are heard. We don't use microphones in our tradition. When you heard that Dr. So-and-so was coming to talk to you, you did not expect this garb, so I feel the need to explain it. Maybe I'm a little self-conscious of the fact that I'm wearing a cassock in front of you. But yes, so I am a reader. We have minor orders in the Byzantine Catholic churches. And yes, I'm a physician, and during the day I'm not dressed like this. I wear a lab coat and my scrub pants underneath the cassock. And that might be more familiar if you're expecting a physician to come and talk to you. But tonight I'm not coming to talk to you as your physician. I'm coming to speak to you as a physician who is your brother in Christ. And I will be speaking to you as a Christian, and therefore I think the cassock is perfectly suitable for this conversation. Even though, of course, the talk is informed by the time I spend at the bedside and in the hospital. Yeah? I'll jump right in very briefly, but I do want to preface by saying that this topic is very sensitive. It is, by definition, a matter of life and death. And while I will be presenting without shame what the church teaches in love on these hard topics, I realize that all of our families, or certainly all of our friends, have been touched by this growing enthusiasm that is surrounding us around euthanasia. And you'll hear me use old words like euthanasia more than MAID or medical assistance in dying, and I'll tell you why. I don't like some of these modern words. But certainly, if I don't make it sufficiently clear during the talk, I want to make it clear, certainly before the talk, that at no point are we going to be criticizing the people who, amidst their suffering, are choosing very bad things. And we're willing to recognize that even some of the people who debate on the other side of this, who don't know the Lord, might even be doing it with good intentions, but they are wrong, and they are not bringing about something that is helping our fellow man, our fellow woman. I don't know where to point this to work right now. Anyway.
It's the arrow.
No? Oh. Maybe then, okay. Maybe if I hold it up, it doesn't work, so, okay, the arrow's changed. Good. So, I'm not infallible. So this is an overview of the topics we will be discussing. Misleading terminology, which connects with what I was just saying a moment ago. I will present the teaching of the magisterium of the church without, covering it up or rounding the corners. I will try to discuss why our country, perhaps more than any other country, is so enthusiastic for MAID. And you recognize in my name that there is a touch of French in both my first name and last name. I'm totally French Canadian, and so I'm not indifferent to the fact that Quebec is the place in the entire world where the most euthanasia is taking place. We will talk about how MAID has really evolved in Canada legally and technically in the hospital. And then we will talk about palliative care, which is the true answer that we should be presenting to the suffering patients, to people who, amidst their illness, are carrying at times a great deal of suffering. And I'll talk a little bit about what we should do on this eve of the March for Life here in Ottawa. A few words about the misleading words, about the false acronyms. MAID, to start with, of course, is an acronym. And acronyms are often used because they're quick and because they don't necessarily force us to say out loud everything that they contain. And this is used in many debatably immoral topics, but for our topic this evening, MAID. So MAID, of course, stands for Medical Assistance in Dying. People, some medical assisted death, but really medical assistance in dying is the original English term, and it conceals something. It conceals the word death already. Furthermore, it is a bit of let's take that back. It is a lie. Because before MAID came to be, there was already, for 30 years, the term palliative care, which described what you do by using medical science to assist people who are suffering. So we have long been medically assisting people in a dying process. And there's nothing wrong with that. But that is not what MAID stands for. MAID is about killing someone, putting an end to their life, using medical science to end the life. No doubt, we're told with good intentions, and I think that intention is again, though misguided, real, the vast majority of the time anyway. But again, the term is false, and that has to be understood. Palliative care could have been called, aptly, medical assistance in dying, because the dying process is natural. But here, that isn't. The dying here is not natural. This is the point I'm trying to make. The technical term here, category 1, category 2, we can talk about that some more, maybe not crucial for this evening. In one case, you are going to a place where the physician and the nurses will directly administer the drugs and ultimately the lethal dose to end your life, versus category 2, where you go to the pharmacy with your great prescription, and then you get all the drugs that you need and the sequence that you need to take, and then maybe you go on a hilltop with your family, have a great last meal, and take the pills yourself. In Canada, more than 99% of MAID is category 1. There is something, I think, that the experience shows that people prefer the act being done externally onto themselves, often by people who do wear a lab coat. That takes away some of the, and you don't expect people with a lab coat to do anything but good medicine. So it is reassuring. But one of the greatest lies that I have not yet given this talk without a little bit of emotion, forgive me. I will try to stay strong for you. The greatest lie is around the use of the word dignity. The largest organization that advocates for more euthanasia in this country, and that started doing it even before MAID was legalized, is Dying with Dignity. I think you've all heard the term. You may have heard people speak. They have a board made of some of the wealthiest and most powerful Canadians. They are a powerful lobby group, and their name is Dying with Dignity. So let's pause for a moment and think of what that means. It means, clearly, that without euthanasia, we are all at risk of dying without dignity. Which means what? It means that disease takes away your dignity. Your dignity is dependent on you having maybe the ability to stand straight, or maybe your fancy red car, or maybe the fact that you're not drooling when you eat. And if any of those things cease, you have lost your dignity. This is the greatest lie. And it's the greatest lie because it takes a fundamentally beautiful Christian concept, which is the one pointed to on the right, which is that we are created in the image and likeness of God. And that is why every human has inherent value, and it completely deformed it. Right? Before Christians, you had in Sparta kids that were examined. This one doesn't look so straight, and tossed out. And in other cultures, horrible things of the same nature, because we didn't believe as humans that we had inherent value. Christians are the ones who flip that around. In truth, the Jews had the book of Genesis before they were Christians. And this is now being misused. We're using the same beautiful word of dignity, which came into the English language through the Christian faith, and we are completely distorting it for this evil use. I point out here that dignity is not the same as external propriety, right? So the fact that you have a fancy house, a big car, the other way around, big house, fancy car, is not actually the reason for your dignity. That's ridiculous, but at the same time, it is what we end up believing if you listen too much to what's outside. And many of us, let's be honest, are formed less and less by the gospel and more by CDC and whatever else we listen to on the radio, and idle chatter outside these walls that are not gospel-based. And unavoidably, I'm sure even Father Rob said, it affects all of us, right? All of these are Kaiser Thursday and the Greatest Trick. You may remember that. This is maybe a generational thing. There's a movie called The Usual Suspect. In it, the character that's the great evil says, he's talking about like this great mafia lord, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world that he didn't exist. But the second greatest trick might be to convince you that you don't have inherent dignity, because then we can do whatever we want with you. St. Leo the Great in the 5th century told us, this is our homily for Christmas, Feast of the Incarnation. Christian, recognize your dignity, for you have become a sharer in the divine nature. And about 1,500 years later, in this document from Vatican II, we are told, since human nature, as he assumed it, was not annulled by the very fact that it has been raised up to a divine dignity in our respect too. And I want to bring out these words where dignity of the human person understood through the lens of the Incarnation and the teaching of the Church comes to have sense with us. Most of what I'll quote this evening is directly, of course, from the Gospel and from Church teaching. This may be the only slide where I have an explicitly non-Christian source, but it's to express the idea deeply. At the end of the Second World War, the entire world realized the atrocities that had occurred, in particular, of course, the genocide, the Shoah, and the reflex of the world was to say, okay, never again. And in order to achieve that, the UN Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated in 1948. And the preamble, so the very first text that you read when you open this document, is the following. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. This is the first sentence. So if you don't believe that, and if people around us in this world who might have different views on me, do not believe that humans have inherent dignity, they disagree, and they're allowed to, I suppose, with the basic premise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what happens, and which, by the way, of course, has Christian roots, but the world after the Second World War realized we have to find some way of getting the entire human family, whether they're Christian or not, to agree on some basic principle. We're not going to mention Jesus, but we have to mention inherent dignity, because otherwise, all of a sudden, someone can say, well, that group, they're not really human. They're not, all the other ones, yes, of course, we don't want to kill all the other nice people, but those people, you can kill them. And that those people can change. It can be the human inside the mother's womb. It can be the old patient who is drooling because they had a stroke. Or it could be the ethnic group that I dislike. But the point is, once you lose this, you lose. But human dignity is a Christian notion. It is inherent. Without it, all crimes are possible. The promotion of euthanasia relies on deceptive language. It seeks to reshape our thinking and discreetly corrupt some of the most beautiful and profound Christian notions. This character on the right, you see lots of icons. Byzantine Christians, we like our icons. I won't not shy about that either. This character was actually taken from an icon of the Nativity, and I think that, anyway, he has two little horns. He does not have a halo. He is not a saint. And he comes and speaks to Joseph right after this is an icon of the birth of Christ, but it's the story before the birth when Joseph has these bad thoughts around how did this come to be that the woman I was promised to marry is now pregnant. The world is whispering a lot of bad thoughts to us. If we don't anchor ourselves, take a good step back, anchor ourselves in the gospel, and look at things fairly objectively, if we just listen to the idle chatter, we can easily fall prey to some dangerous and lethal nonsense. We're told that euthanasia, of course, is killing, but if someone's willing to admit it, which when you're in a serious conversation you're forced to, but don't worry, it's out of compassion. So let's think about that for a moment. Again, words are important. Compassion comes from the Latin. I studied just a little bit of Latin, but lesson number 3, you learned that cum means with. Okay, so compassion is with passion. Passion comes from the word to suffer. And so compassion means you're willing to suffer with. euthanasia is not compassion. Pope Francis used to always repeat that we would have to be willing to walk along the people in the margins and the suffering people. By definition here, if we are in favor of euthanasia, it's because we don't want to walk along. It's painful sometimes. It can be many years, as Father Rob's sister noticed. And sometimes we like to have our schedule well planned, because I have some summer holidays I'm trying to sort of. And if mom is sick, I don't know what I'm going to do to go to my summer holidays. It gets in the way. And so it's precisely avoiding suffering with that makes us eliminate the one suffering rather than seek to eliminate the suffering itself without patient. This, of course, is an icon of the Good Samaritan, where naturally the Good Samaritan himself, Jesus is telling the parable, but the Good Samaritan himself is an image of our Lord, of Christ, and the innkeeper is an image of the church. So, a few years ago, when euthanasia was already starting to ramp up in Canada, somewhat timely, I don't know if Rome was listening to Canada's needs, but the congregation at the time was still the congregation, now it's the dicastery, for the doctrine of the faith, issued this letter called Samaritanus Bonus, the Good Samaritan, on the care of persons in the critical and terminal phase of life. Very good for our topic this evening. It says many things, but in case there's any doubts, it reaffirms the teaching of the church for 2,000 years. The church finds it a necessity to reaffirm as definitive teaching, not one of these things that was just decided based on the weather, that euthanasia is a crime against human life. And then it speaks to people who might surround the patients, people like doctors, maybe family members. Any formal or immediate material cooperation in such an act, euthanasia, is a grave sin against human life. And this is important because healthcare in Canada is public, and we don't like when people who get paid with public dollars don't drink the Kool-Aid that every Canadian is supposed to drink, which clearly now means euthanasia is wonderful, and the more the better. So this is more when I speak to physicians and healthcare workers that I bring this up, but Catholic theology and Catholic moral teaching sometimes, believe it or not, finds great echoes in The Simpsons. I don't know if you knew this. Where you put down your catechism and watch The Simpsons. And so in this episode, Homer, who's already quite a big guy, I think you all know, is seeking to get even bigger so that he could get some disability payments, something of the sort. And so he goes to his physician and says that he wants help because he's not succeeding to gain those last few pounds that would get him disability payments. So he needs help to get even bigger, less healthy, we all realize. And Dr. Haber says, my God, that's monstrous. I've never heard of anything so negligent. I'll have no part of this. And when Homer says, can you recommend a doctor who will? His answer is immediately positive. This is what Catholic physicians, for the record, are asked to do by the CPSO. We are allowed not to kill you ourselves, but then, come on, we have to send you promptly to the kind physician who will execute you. Key takeaway number 2, the Church's magisterium is unequivocal. Any cooperation in euthanasia, which is the deliberate killing of a human person, is a grave violation of the law of God. Here we see Moses receiving the commandments. Now, suffering is not new. The great paradox is that actually it is in our current context of the last 20-ish years that the popularity of euthanasia, first theoretically and now concretely, sprung up in the Western world. And yet it is in the last 30, 40 years that we've become better and better and better at treating physical symptoms of illness. Right? We have a much better handle and a much broader array of pharmaceutical drugs to treat physical pain. In the Middle Ages, needless to say, not so good. There was more pain, more physical suffering back then, no doubt. And yet there was not an outcry that suddenly we all needed euthanasia. And so it is a paradox, I think we have to recognize, that as we are better at treating physical pain, we are simultaneously saying we absolutely must be able to end her life because of pain. And there's a bit of a hypocrisy there, which is one that I have to dispel as a physician, and I assure you, and this I'm being honest, my colleagues who are not believers, who are not opposed, for many of them, to euthanasia, I was working in Toronto when this first came to be in 2016, were willing to say out loud in friendly conversation, yeah, people should be allowed to, this is their position, that people should be allowed to die if they want to. But all this talk about uncontrolled suffering, this is utter nonsense. We're very good at controlling suffering. But the people, I think, at Dying Dignity had calculated that this would be a good way to present it to the Canadians. In this famous case, the Sue Rodriguez case, we learned the following, published in the Globe and Mail, not in a super pro-Catholic, biased, right-wing, I don't know what media. Ms. Rodriguez had access to excellent palliative care in the early 1990s, yet she wanted to live until she herself chose the moment of her death. Palliative care cannot provide that sense of control or choice, and that is precisely what Mrs. Rodriguez was seeking. And I would argue that while there are many, many different reasons why people end up asking for euthanasia, the wealthy, powerful people, for example, in Dying Dignity, who advocate for this, are very much in this camp. Control, control, control. Autonomy and control. The people who end up using it are much poorer, less knowledgeable, less wealthy, and are of a different category altogether. But the people who have advocated that this is absolutely necessary for all Canadians were thinking exactly this. Palliative care effectively relieves physical pain, but it does not resolve existential suffering. Right? And so you may still not like the image of yourself as a drooling person. Even if your physical pain is dealt with, you may have the belief that you do not have inherent dignity. Now, I think our responsibility then is to show you that you do. But when a doctor is approached by a patient who says, look at me, look at how I used to be able to do all these things and now I can't, in this day and age, would you be surprised if a doctor can be like looking at them and says like, yeah, I kind of agree with you. That kind of sucks. I understand that you want to die. I want to die if I were you. Because this is how we think now. Because we don't have three dimensions in our understanding of the human person. And we don't genuinely believe, many of us, not in this room, not in the church, but in the world that we belong to, we don't genuinely believe as a Canadian society that the poor and the sick and the frail are just as valuable as everyone else who is driving a nice car and owning a fancy house. Key takeaway number 3, enthusiasm for euthanasia does not arise from physical suffering, which is well managed by modern palliative care. It arises from desire for control and from existential void, loneliness, loss of self-worth, grief, fear, and shame. I don't want to take too much time. This is the story. I mean, you know that in 2015 there was the Carter case. It's the Carter case that decriminalized euthanasia. Until then, if a doctor killed his patient with drugs, even if the patient was suffering, it was murder. It was homicide. And it would have been under the criminal code. So the thought of having doctors being sent to jail for MAID didn't sound too good once the Carter said you should allow this, because apparently prohibiting it was contrary to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And just while we're at it, this is when the college, this is in Ontario now, this is when the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario decided to remove the protection of physicians for their conscience, meaning no longer allow conscientious objection. No longer allowed to say to a patient, while absolutely it is within your rights to pursue this, and I'm willing to accompany you in all sorts of other ways and explore other avenues of you, this is one that I couldn't participate with you. That would be much too harsh, judgmental, and probably in the fear-mongering world might prevent Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so from obtaining the quote-unquote care that they obviously shouldn't have. MAID, I will use it exceptionally now, has evolved very quickly such that the many guardrails that had been placed initially in keeping with the Carter case were promptly removed. So the judges of the Supreme Court, when they decriminalized the homicide of patients who are suffering, which came to be called Made in Canada, said, well, you're going to have to regulate this carefully. And we did for 2-3 years. And then we started to remove these guardrails, okay? So let's look. I mentioned here, because this was very troubling in the field, first what started happening is that we simply stopped doing what the law was requiring. But do you remember when, and no one was doing anything about it, do you remember when like everyone kind of felt that cannabis was going to become legal?
Yeah.
Like you could hardly find police officers who were going to go and like arrest people selling weed 2 years before weed was legal. People can smell the air, not only cannabis. And so the same was true in this context. Euthanasia is wonderful. We need more and more euthanasia. We're not going to go and like sanction the insufficient number of doctors that we have who are providing this great service to Canadian society. So those who quote, this is an actual quote, this what we are doing, i.e. acting outside beyond the boundaries of the law, is not an expansion of our law, but a maturation of our understanding of what we are doing. This is physicians that were doing things outside the scope of the law, meaning not waiting the 10 days that they were supposed to wait for, or perhaps doing it even though the patient was no longer fully capable, which they weren't, because they're supposed to be capable when you're making the request, but also capable when it's being delivered to you. And you can't, at the time, you couldn't euthanize someone who's not responsive, for example, because maybe they would have changed their mind if you could speak to them. And perhaps their physical suffering isn't the end of the world if they're not responsive right now, if they're basically sleeping. So eligibility criteria were formally expanded. The practice was rapidly banalized. Truchon, this is a Quebec Superior Court ruling, deemed it unconstitutional. Once again, our constitution used in every direction that we would like. Unconstitutional that the death be deemed reasonably foreseeable. So this is a big one. People were initially told, don't worry, euthanasia is only for people who are, very advanced in their disease, and they're basically going to die soon anyway. And like, what's the difference? Palliative care, euthanasia, maybe a few days difference, a few weeks different, but come on. That had to be reasonably foreseeable. Now, between you and I, every doctor and every lawyer, I'm told, was scratching their head like, what is reasonably foreseeable? Is your death, ma'am, not reasonably foreseeable? And yours, like, is it 1 year? Is it 3 months? Is it 10 years? Like, it's reasonably foreseeable that everyone in this room is going to die. Okay? So it's an absurd, and then like you're saying like this will be the guardrail. Tough. As silly as a 3-month duration would have been, because it would have been super arbitrary, we can all appreciate it would have at least forced doctors to write on the chart, my professional opinion is that this patient will die of a natural cause within 3 months. Now you don't even have to do that. All you have to say is, it's reasonably foreseeable. But that was still kind of annoying. So that was scratched by the, so if someone has morbid obesity and they want to die, they can now ask for, it started with the Truchon case, but that has been expanded. So, some of the safeguards. There was a minimum 10-day reflection period, that's gone. There was protection against possible coercion through 2 independent witnesses, that's gone. There was the ability to withdraw consent, as I was saying, at any time prior to receiving the procedure, and therefore the need to remain, it's not that you can't say no, of course if you change your mind, you're allowed to change your mind, but if you become unconscious now, too bad, so sad, you signed the paper the other day, so we'll proceed. And then there was the notion of the need for 2 independent physicians acting as maid assessors. But then the experience has also taught us something else. The maid assessor community is a very small community. There are not that many doctors who do maid assessments. And how can I say this? Like, if there are 3 mechanics working in a shop and one told you that your engine needs to be changed, and there are 3 friends, do you think that the other mechanic is going to tell you that the engine doesn't need to be changed? Even if suddenly he's like, oh, I think the first engine just needs tightening of that bolt. It would make the other mechanic look pretty bad. Independent is the key word here. Highly debatable. In March 2021, Parliament revised the eligibility criteria, that's the IBSL, there you go, French Canadian. It removed the requirement that natural death be reasonably foreseeable. This was the nationalization of the beautiful Truchon idea, the Quebec one, and introduced a two-track approach, so that now there's two types of MAID. This is different from what I was saying earlier. There's also two ways of administering MAID, right? So either that in hospital injection or on the mountaintop pills that you bought at the pharmacy. But there's also two tracks. The idea being here, either you're someone with a reasonably foreseeable death, in which case we can take care of you very quickly, or your death is absolutely not reasonably foreseeable. Don't worry, we are compassionate people. We will still look after you and eliminate you soon enough. But 6 months right now is how long it's going to take us. Okay. Forgive me for some of the cynical comments I make. That is a defense mechanism. Otherwise, I'd have more tears in my eyes.
It's appropriate.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it is.
I can't have tears in my eyes at every slide. Okay. So it would get boring for you guys too. Okay, so who gets track 2 MAID? That is to say, who gets the MAID that is not for people who are likely to die soon? We have data now. Younger patients. It's not that they are more likely than, to be clear, it's not that they are more 18 to 59 than the elderly. It's just that the ratio of 18 to 59 is much higher in track 2 MAID. Okay, I'll understand. Predominantly women, which is not the case in track 1 MAID. Disproportionately poor and socially marginalized. And you've heard on CBC and even Toronto Star, again not known to be the most Catholic newspaper in the country, point the finger at this problem, because people who are living in terrible housing situations, people who are very poor, who are realizing that amidst their disability, there's basically no public services for them, very minimal public services, such that they would live in like quasi, sub-third world conditions. They despair, and they realize there's still the option of the exit button, which is this, and so they ask for it. And of course we provide it for them. But then the really shameful data, which kudos to CDC for being willing to point this out, only 8.6% of these people who had received track 2 MAID were offered housing support. And only 6% were offered financial assistance. Needless to say, track 2 MAID is much less expensive than long-term financial assistance to someone who is poor and living with a disability. Much of that slide is repeated, I guess, for some reason, but in the bottom right, from a secular lens, you may explore the notion of luxury belief. So my wife listens to all these podcasts where she tells me a lot about what the cool people know about that I don't know about. And even in the non-Christian world, people are starting to realize that there's a number of these things that are believed by many, but then misused by the poor. And the social destruction that comes from the widespread use of abortion, for example. Well, surprise, surprise, will affect women in poor African American neighborhoods of some poor U.S. city. More so, it'll have a more destructive consequence on these types of communities than the wealthy neighborhoods of Hollywood. Right? Abortion will take place in both locations, but the impact on the social fabric is different among the socially marginalized. The choice for the privileged, remember who is advocating that we need euthanasia in Canada, becomes a burden for the vulnerable. This is very, very, I think that this may be one of the, it's not, in terms of studying our society, I think this is a very important point. It's not directly church teaching, so I didn't emphasize it, but if you're trying to understand, this may be a way to speak to your friends who are not Christians about why euthanasia is so wrong. But hopefully they can also come to believe that they were created in the image likeness of God, and that matters. Otherwise, no life matters. Bill 11, pronounced in June 2023 and implemented in 2024 in the province of Quebec, defines the clients. In medicine, it's always very striking when the word clients comes up. We tend to call people patients in medicine. But maybe the Quebec government sees it differently. The clients who are eligible to make an advance request for medical aid in dying, okay, and this was also the bill in which they enforced palliative care homes in Quebec, even those that had clearly been run by, say, nuns for the last 100 years. Basically, if you want to continue being a palliative care home in Quebec, you need to drink Kool-Aid. Until then, there have been institutional protections. And this is being fought by the Archbishop of Montreal. I don't know where that legal battle is, but needless to say, it's not held up. These are some of the numbers. We mentioned that Canada has the most rapid rise. This was mentioned as the statistics earlier. These are some of the numbers. 2019, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000. 2020, around 7,000. These are the number of people dying of MAID, being killed. Nearly 10,000 in 2021, 13,000, and the rate goes up. It's interesting, in the documents where the Statistics Canada presents this, they are very quick to reassure you. I don't think they like the advertisement that we have the fastest growing rate of euthanasia. It's not very good PR. So they're very quick to reassure us, don't worry, our rate of increase is reducing. So we're still increasing, of course, every year. But our rate of increasing is, in 10 years, we might start to plateau. Is the news that we're told. That's why we shouldn't worry. Even though by then we will have far surpassed the Netherlands, and we will be by far leading, because we're very close to the Netherlands as a country already. Quebec as a region is already world leading, but the gold medal is for us. We're coming. On the horizon, progress always means more. You cannot be static in the progressive mindset. It's not enough to have, the battle of the 60s is no longer the battle of the 90s, and it's certainly not the battle of the 2020s. So now we are moving towards euthanasia by advance directive, so that you can say ahead of time, well, when I'm diagnosed with dementia, maybe by the time it's moderate severity, come and take care of me. I might not be legally capable of saying anything to my lawyers at that point, but I want to make sure ahead of time that no one would ever put me in that terrible situation where I am not eliminated promptly when that diagnosis is made. We also, in medicine in Canada, anytime you're deemed capable, regardless of your age, you can ask your doctors to do unto you whatever adults can do, right? There's no, pediatrics looks after kids and internal medicine looks after people above the age of 18, but legally speaking, whether you can vote or not does not change whether you can ask for procedures or not. And that's why the 12-year-old girl who asked her family physician for the birth control pill, if the family physician deems that the young girl understands, the young woman understands the implications, no other family members need to be involved in that conversation, and the prescription is given. But likewise, if that 12-year-old girl feels that her life is not worth living because she suffers from the same kind of illnesses that some of the older patients evoke track 2 for, that is to say, for example, morbid obesity, who are we to block this 12-year-old girl from requesting track 2 MAID to end her suffering? How could we be so cruel as to limit her from making that request? And what has also come back to the news a few times is this promise that we were made that mental health patients with a pure mental health diagnosis will also be allowed to request. You may remember the caricature I showed earlier about the person in the wheelchair and the assisted death had a railing, whereas there were steps up to the suicide prevention office. How is this coming to be? Why is this happening? Why is Canadian society changing this way? This is, again, just sharing some thoughts. This is not a sermon. The BMJ, the British Medical Journal, actually looked at this. They were interested to know how Canadians are behaving in a way that's kind of like, ooh, that's like up there, even for the Europeans. And so we discovered that when we review, thousands and thousands and thousands of newspapers' portrayals of physicians' role, we discover that although religious groups and many physicians oppose MAID, the newspaper in Canada, right, this is the paper news, not that's what the study looked at, primarily focused all of their publications on portraying MAID developments positively. So the media for the last 30 years has been painting a positive picture of this compassionate procedure to Canadians, and surprise, surprise, they have achieved the brainwashing that they wanted, and so now we are, as a society, quite convinced that if my dog can receive euthanasia out of compassion, well, why can't mom? This represents framing asymmetry, meaning the newspaper, even the BMJ, again, not a publication out of the Vatican, but the British Medical Journal tells us that Canadian media seems to have really done a lot of framing asymmetry, talking about like some of the positives, but really not framing a lot of the problems that come with euthanasia in a fair way, leaving us Canadians with a lot of knowledge gaps and limited depth of debate. Like, I mean, seriously, this is Canadian society. There's no such thing as debate anymore. I mean, obviously, social media, you're allowed to insult your opponent, and in 3 sentences, like if you have more than 2 sentences of comments to make, you're talking too long. Stop right now. The debate is over, and you're racist. That was not my comment. I echoed someone's comment, and I was told by Father, the troublemaker group. We love everyone. Key takeaway number 4: in less than a decade in Canada, euthanasia has moved from decriminalization, right? So we barely took it out of the fact that you're going to jail for years and years and years for doing this, to normalization, and now active promotion. We can't have enough of it. It's great. We should give it to people with mental health. We should give it to kids. We should give more of it. And don't worry, we're getting more of it. The pro-life perspective has been marginalized. In fact, like, let's be honest, when some of us are walking in the streets of Ottawa tomorrow for the March for Life, the world looks at us like we have 3 heads. Like, we are the most backward, crazy people that you can imagine. You can say, oh, but come on, there's so many Christians in Canada, there's many Catholics in Canada. We are not taking our faith nearly seriously enough. We are not communicating a message in a nearly compelling, okay, again, French, okay. Our message is not compelling enough. And we have not been able to reach people, certainly through the media, and we are not well formed. If ever someone comes to us, we don't always have the right words to discuss this situation. But this is also not just a question of ideas, and we'll get to that, because there is the intellectual debate, but there's more than just an intellectual debate. In some ways, I think the second part is actually more important and more compelling for the world. Now, I want to say 2-3 words about this aspect, because actually, in the hospital, when I do deal with Christians that come to the hospital, often Catholics, of course, all of healthcare is seen as the great evil. You can't trust your doctor, because maybe they want to just throw euthanasia at you. And even things that are totally in line with Catholic teaching are feared by good Catholics who come to the hospital. Okay? This is the reality. So I want to speak a little bit about that, because I'm hoping that when you see me with my lab coat and not with my cassock, you won't be afraid of me if I talk about certain things that might actually be sorry, I thought for a moment, no. Your question will certainly be encouraged, if it's needed now, yes, or otherwise later. So, in his gospel entitled Evangelium Vitae, St. John Paul II used terms that are, I think, now very much the cornerstone of Catholic bioethics, speaking of disproportionate means and extraordinary means. Certain things that we can do at the end of life that might make sense in some circumstances are exaggerated in other circumstances and are not to be offered in all circumstances. We are not supposed to all die after attempts of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, intubated with a ventilator, trying to force air into our lungs so that we can stay alive for a few extra minutes. That is not what the church is saying. Now, at the same time, these things can be very reasonable to some people. 45-year-old man has a heart attack, all these things, the CPR, the defibrillation, the rushing, the intubation, all that can make sense and can be life-saving, though it's not like the movies. The movies like a little romantic on that point. But it's also not something that we should all be subjected to on our deathbed. In fact, there is no such thing as dying peacefully, which the church is very much in favor of, with CPR, intubation, all these things, if that's necessarily part of the cocktail at the end. And in a hospital setting, these things are default unless we have a conversation. usually not a super joyful one, because we're talking about what are we going to do when your heart stops. No? But an important one, so that we can, in the right circumstances, allow people to have a peaceful, natural death. That is, of course, not at all talking about hastening death. It's about not doing super extraordinary things. To use John Paul II's word, extraordinary means at the time. This is not euthanasia. The word DNR, which is a very bad word, which is all framed upside down, it means do not resuscitate. So it's just like bad presentation altogether. People are asked, do you want us not to resuscitate you? Which of course sounds like, do you want less care? Do you want the full package? Or do you want the cheap package? You're not going to worry. You didn't pay for resuscitation. You're not going to offer it. It's negligible. So wise people in the US are trying to get the term AND, another three-letter acronym, allow natural death, which I think is a much better way to present this very idea. Okay? It is totally reasonable. Okay, I was going to say, if you're a 90-year-old person with advanced cancer, not to be, not being ageist or fighting against cancer, just taking an example here. Probably, if you're in hospital with advanced disease, lots of comorbidities, the idea of subjecting you to very aggressive resuscitation attempts would not be appropriate. They would be extremely unlikely to succeed at all. But even if they succeed in the short term, that might just mean an extra 2 days on an intubated and still dying, of course, because you've done nothing to the cancer, etc. So forgive me for getting a little bit in a tangent, but I think it's important because I often get questions at the end about some of the stress because you basically can't show up at the hospital and not be asked often by an awkward resident or medical student or nurse, but like, do you want everything done? Or do you want us to let you die when you die?
Make you comfortable.
Okay, maybe that's the second year resident thing. The best thing you know, I've heard my poor residents. I heard lots of versions, but yes, okay, make you comfortable. So ultimately, it's important to understand what they're trying to say, which they often don't communicate clearly even to the secular ear, and also how that fits in with Canadian healthcare. And there are people in healthcare who don't truly understand what this is either, and who might actually think, oh, they're DNR, so maybe we shouldn't do the surgery for their appendicitis, which is completely absurd. It has nothing to do with anything. But people in healthcare, like the guy who had flipped over his, are not infallible. Okay? So, there you go. I'll skip that for now, we can address it later. In my tradition, which, by the way, and I think Father Rob will forgive me if I say, at 6 p.m. on Saturday night, for those of you who attend church on Sunday, because there's probably an anticipated mass, but 6 p.m. Saturday evening, we always have a great vespers at St. John the Baptist. You're all invited. And we say in the long litany of petitions that is normally said by the deacon, among many others, for a Christian end to our lives, one that is painless, unashamed, and peaceful, and for a good defense of the awesome tribunal of Christ, let us ask. And we answer, grant this, O Lord. It is okay to ask the Lord for a painless, unashamed, and peaceful death, right? We don't all need to be intubated at the end. Perhaps some of us will be, but it's okay to ask for peaceful death. Which does not mean euthanasia. Not the same thing. Okay, what is palliative care? Another thing that is not the same thing as euthanasia. Palliative care provides specialized medical care for people with serious illness. It focuses on relieving symptoms and reducing the stress of disease. It aims to improve quality of life for both patients and their caregivers and their families. Palliative care is not a place. Very often people think, you're talking about palliative, so are you going to send me to a palliative care unit or to a hospice? And of course, palliative care can be offered in a palliative care unit. But palliative care can be offered at home. Palliative care is not exclusively given to people who will never be healed. Palliative care is not synonymous with imminent death. Okay? It is a field of medicine that focuses on alleviating the suffering, the symptoms of the illness, sometimes the symptoms of the treatment. Much progress has been done, the terrible nausea and vomiting that can occur with chemotherapy regimen. We are now much better at treating thanks to palliative care advances in parallel with oncologic science that brought on all these terrible poisons, which are more terrible for the cancer than it is for you, but it's still potentially quite unpleasant, right? And so this is important to understand. And of course, palliative care is completely in keeping with the Church's teaching. Back to this document, Samaritanos Bonus, we read in that document, palliative care is an authentic expression. So it basically, the document starts by saying, as I said earlier, euthanasia is wrong. But then, what can we do then? Palliative care is an authentic expression of the human and Christian activity of providing care, the tangible symbol of the compassionate remaining at the side of the suffering person. Remember that word compassion that I spent some time on? So that is suffering with. That is walking alongside the suffering one. Even when it's difficult, even when there's some anxiety, some angst, we're like, how long is this going to be? Oh, I don't know. It can be uncomfortable. Sometimes you don't know what conversation to have on day 10, perhaps, right? And that's okay. That's okay. We walk together. With all the brokenness that we have. And we see, and of course we address the fact that the suffering is not purely physical. Yes, we have drugs, but so much of what is needed is around care. That's when the village and the community becomes so important. And around an attentive ear, right? A loving presence. Those who are enthusiastic with euthanasia and who are trying to convince the world, like Kaiser Soze and the devil, that that euthanasia is a Kool-Aid that we should all be drinking, have a vested interest in blurring the lines between palliative care and euthanasia. And of course, there are palliative care doctors out there who have no problem with euthanasia, though these are different fields, right? By and large, any traditional palliative care doctor, certainly, and still many of the younger ones, see it as two completely different fields that shouldn't talk. In the Canadian context, they are forced to talk more and more, but conceptually they remain different. But you can see, again, it's too small here, but you can see how some guy here we see in the bottom right, palliative care, and in the same little box, palliative care, and then the second bullet, euthanasia, or maybe, because it's, of course, using the good lingo, is presented as being part of the palliative care bullet. That is a lie, okay? Should patients with Parkinson's disease have palliative care? Absolutely. Should they be offered euthanasia? I'll let you decide. Key takeaway number 5, palliative care seeks to relieve suffering throughout the illness, while providing compassionate, appropriate human support. And when practiced authentically, it is not only compatible with, but actively encouraged by the magisterium. I hope I'm not taking too much of your time. You know, our liturgies in the Byzantine world are way too long. I mean, I love them that way. But you might find it hard the first time you come, even though you're still invited at 6 p.m. on Saturday. Vespers is an hour-ish. Just so you know. When you come, you won't cry. There are many ways that we can learn more about this. I wanted to point out the fact that our Canadian Catholic bishops have launched this thing called Horizons of Hope, which parishes can take on. Maybe this is something that your pro-life group locally could do. It's meant to help parishes not only learn about the realities of euthanasia as we're kind of doing this evening, but also equip the community to see how we can support each other better. Not only by knowing the name of that other parishioner that you always see, but you know you didn't really ask their name because like it might be weird to like say hi to someone at church. But also, so yes, we need to build a much more tighter knit Christian community, but also how we can support the sick people in our parish and hopefully even beyond. In the time of our Lord, there were these lepers that were placed in these external things with walls and that no one had to worry about because that was gross and legitimately, a concern that they would get infected. We can cure leprosy today, so we can't necessarily relate exactly to this icon where we see lepers. I don't know, there's actually an antibiotic for this solved. But it's actually not solved because we have new lepers. We have the new people that we've built walls around and that we don't really want to see, and we even less want to waste our Saturday afternoons visiting. Okay, these are people in long-term care facilities. These are people in hospitals, perhaps. These are people in retirement homes that don't have families and don't have friends and don't have visitors. I will be honest with you, I round and I see my patients, and I have my own family. Like at 5 p.m., 5:30, I start to look at I've been in the hospital for many hours. I think, okay, it's time for me to go back home. I cannot stay with my patients all day, and I don't. I'm not. I think I show Mother Teresa that I'm not Mother Teresa. But it breaks my heart when I realize that I'm the only visitor that my patients, receive. It isn't right. There's no way that we can frame our Canadian society to be a good society when we have people who are suffering with their physical illness and who have no loving voice. Only the people who are paid to see them. I have no merit to visit the sick. The Lord says go visit the sick. But I can't take any merit because I built one. Okay, I'm sharing this with you crassly. In truth, that is not, the Lord asks more of me. Hopefully I do a little bit this way. But the point is, please God, let us all find ways to help our society, to rebuild the village where we can help the neighbor, right? These are the new outcasts. And we have examples, modern examples, like Saint Mother Teresa, who show us how to be like the great physician of soul and body, our Lord Jesus Christ, right? Who himself shared, and as I said, this is the full icon now. You see the Good Samaritan healing the wounds, and carrying and then giving the 2 coins to the innkeeper. And I said the innkeeper, when St. John Chrysostom talks about this parable, he says, we the church are the innkeeper. And in fact, if you look at the vestments of the innkeeper, they're just like our priest. This is like a chasuble, a Byzantine chasuble, if you will. We the church have to show the world that we care for the ones that are forgotten by the others, so that they cannot say no one loves them. And until we can show them that we love them, all the rhetoric around this is sin, this is wrong, not enough. It starts by recognizing that they have inherent dignity. But that is a call to action for us to go and show them love. In Matthew 25, the Lord says, "For I was sick and you visited me. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Right? And this is a passage that no one can read. Atheist, non-believer, no one can read this and not be moved. Because deep down everyone wants this to be true. But they need the Christians to show them that it is true. This is another picture of the Byzantine parish, because we like to prostrate a lot in Lent, and we have long service, as I said. Obviously, this has to be rooted in prayer and fasting. This is what every Christian endeavor starts with prayer and fasting. And it's the Lord who gives us the strength to follow His example. We do not have the strength. The gym won't give you the strength. Only the Lord can give you the strength. And this is timely because tomorrow is the March for Life. But I tell people one of the ways to do this, is certainly not the only way, is and Deacon Guy reminds us of this whenever he's present for these talks, that one of the ways that we should do this is we should mention to our elected leaders that this issue matters. I lamented in my talk that the media is not presenting this enough, and that's true. And certainly the political elites can ignore this issue if only, less than a handful of Canadians makes a stink about it. Key takeaway number 6, euthanasia is first and foremost a cry for help. I was sick and you visited me, I was in prison and you came to me. Let us commit ourselves, organize ourselves, and visit the sick and the abandoned. And this, I think, really does start in the parish. I'm not attacking this particular parish, I look at my own. If within our own parish, we are not good at visiting the sick, and I know that in my parish we're not that good at visiting the sick, then we're far from the mark of visiting the other people who don't belong to this parish, of which there are many. Right? Let us defend life from conception to natural death. Let us share the good news for the life of the world.